Okay, let's begin. I am Lanice Antoine Shelley, and I'll be your host through constructive, healing-based conversations designed to empower adoptees and the adoption curious. Through the lens of experts and lived experiences, we focus on alchemizing our stories into maximum social impact. These are the voices who could not speak when they were young.
I'm just really curious about what got you into podcasting. I did go through some of your episodes, and you've got some phenomenal folks I've known in the adoptee community for a while. And I was just curious what got you started on specifically the title of your podcast, pointed towards young adoptees, maybe. I'm curious about that.
Well, okay. This would be a great time to answer that. I don't know if I've answered that over the podcast directly. I started out facilitating panels in 2020, and that was launched because of the murder of George Floyd. And for us interracial adoptees, that was a very activating moment in time because we realized that we couldn't go home and talk about what's happening in the world, the explosion of injustice, the explosion of racism brought to the fore in a way that it had never been scrutinized before. So I knew that I had to start the conversation as a Haitian adoptee and as someone who grew up in an all-white community. And I knew that I wasn't alone in the frustration and confusion and feeling of aloneness during that time. And so, sponsored by the U.S. Foundation for the Children of Haiti, which is the organization that helms the orphanage that I came from in Port-au-Prince, I launched a series of panels, and I brought a vast array of interracial adoptees to talk about identity, race, family, belonging. And we installed them on, and there was just a great response. We garnered over, at this point, it's about 12,000 views. And I knew I had to continue the conversation, but I didn't want to continue as a panel facilitator because, to be honest, wrangling adoptees is like wrangling cats in the rain.
I understand that sentiment. I do.
I was like, I can't do this. I can do one-on-ones with people. And I also observed what was already out there, what was out in the world for adoptees. There wasn't much, and what was out there was centered on stories, on people divulging their stories, which is great. And I think that is valid and necessary as well. But I wanted to do a spin which made me feel like I was leading from self, which is wellness, alchemizing trauma into a thriving, flourishing existence. That is the main focus of my podcast. And I call it When They Were Young because our trauma started when we were young. And now we are adoptees talking about our youth, talking about what happened when we were young, and giving voice to who we were, what we desired that was squelched, that was suppressed, that was repressed by our caregivers when we were young. And so now I center those adoptee voices. I center the opportunities, the resources, just the perspective of there is a way for you to exist outside of your trauma that will allow you to flourish.
Wow, that is phenomenal. And what a gift. I'm really glad that you have such a heart for this work and such a gift, I think, for hosting interviewees. I found when I was listening to some of your prior work. So I'm excited and honored to be here.
Well,
in a small way.
Thank you. Oh, it's a large way because I see the work that you're doing on Instagram and on TikTok, and it's really inspiring. And I bring adoptees and humans rather that are just inspiring. No matter whether you're an adoptee or not, I think people will resonate with your work. And you sent me the submissions for poetry. When I was younger, I was a poet. I was a part of an urban slam poetry group called Urban Scribes Project. And I no longer write, but I still read a lot of poetry. I read a lot of Pablo Neruda. Are
Mm.
you a poet? What inspired you to facilitate these opportunities for poets who are adoptees?
I think giving me the label poet is far too generous. I'm not. I'm just an adoptee who understands that poetry often what comes out of a long lifetime of mixed emotions and complexity. I think so often we grow up as adoptees feeling like our voice is lost, our identity is muddled, and it's hard to figure out who and what we are. And somehow I have always found if I turn to my weak and very amateur attempts at poetry, I find words for things that I thought were bigger than words and more complicated than my little brain could wrap around. So poetry's always been there for me in a very just amateur, in my room by myself kind of way. And played a big part, I think, in coming out of the fog when my life events sort of led me to re-examine my adoption experience. And the first thing I did was write some poetry. Terrible poetry, which I will never show anyone to read, but just poetry. And so I found a lot of times for adoptees in particular, for those of us with disenfranchised identities, we think it's lost and we think it's beyond words. And yet, when we sit down and quiet ourselves and let our thoughts turn to the lyrical and the nonsensical and the metaphor, there's patterns there. It's still there and it comes forth when we give it time to shine. So I've been hosting this poetry contest every other year, just on occasion, as genuinely just a gift for adoptees who would like to try poetry and enjoy that recognition as well. And it's not so much about being the world's best writer or an excellent poet as it is just using your voice in a poetic form. And I select a panel of judges from a diverse experience of adoption who take the time to read every single poem and leave a comment to encourage that adoptee, both in their voice and as a writer, to say, hey, I see you. I recognize you. And these words that maybe you feel like nervous to put on a page, or these declarations that feel like maybe too much or too little, um, aren't too much or too little for me. Like I see that, and it's part of your identity, and it's part of who you are. And I'm glad to be able to recognize that for you. So submissions just closed for this year, so you'll have to wait 2 more years if anyone listening wants to participate. But we'll be announcing the winners here in a few days, and then we'll have all of the poems available to read, which is frankly just as healing as writing the poems, to see the incredible ways that adoptees express themselves in poetry.
Well, art has been a haven for a lot of adoptees. And as you said, for those of us who have felt lost, who have felt that we do not belong or have a home or feel like we're a misfit in
Mm.
I call it the assignment. The adoptees have an assignment of a family, an assigned identity that they take on. And
Mhm.
it's such a healing thing to be able to write about it, put it on paper. And the fact that you're creating a platform for that is so generous of you. I know that there's a prize. Where do you get
Correct.
the funds for the prize?
That's my personal money. I give. I get a little bit, a very small amount of income from coaching. I do offer one-on-one coaching for adoptees, and I charge a fee, of course, for that. And I break even on a good year for the funds for that. But I happen to have come to my position right now in life where I have a decent job. I am able to cover my needs. The same can't be said for many adoptees and former foster youth. And I just feel obligated to give back in a little way. So that's just me, just finding a little extra change that I've got to shave off the top and make sure that adoptees are compensated for their intellectual labor and their emotional labor as well.
Well, I'm sure it's well received because, as you said, there are so many adoptees who are struggling financially, who are struggling mentally, spiritually, emotionally, and to have that little gift of you giving them an artistic platform and an artistic outlet, and also to have some funds as well is such a magnanimous gesture from you.
Yeah, yeah. Well, more importantly, too, I feel in the internet sphere, when adoptees share their voices, we're not often compensated for this, right? Like it's just not the opportunity that we all have. But that doesn't mean that our intellectual efforts don't have incredible value and our perspectives aren't incredibly worthy of that. And I try to remind, adoptees of that in any opportunity that I have, just so that they know. Sometimes people treat our voice like it's just like, oh, your diary and you just want to share your sad little thoughts. And it's like, no, we're putting incredible effort into providing critique of social norms, of family expectations, of roles, of personality, of identity that is valuable for everyone and needs to be recognized as such. And so I try to add that appropriate dignifier to any opportunity that I can.
Well, thank you. I was looking over your website and you have the phrase someone else's child. And I wanted to just go deeper into that. What does that mean for you, living
I love
as
it.
someone else's child?
Yeah, I love that you picked up on that little phrase, and I use it in all of my biographies when I send them in for things because it's important to remember. I think it's a recognition of the before the fog moment that all of us had, and all of us start our adoption experience in this identity of someone else's child. If you think about the first two things you learn as a child in any home is your first name that your parents give you and the last name that is your parents' family name, right? These 2 points of identity that belong to someone and is supposed to belong to you now. And I think a lot of adoptees take that and run with that and live their very best life like that. And I say that. I say, I really did try to live my life as the child of the people who adopted me. And it was always slightly dissident, just ever so slightly. It was a role. And it was hard to accept that when I came out of the fog because I wanted it not to be a role. I wanted it to be true. I wanted to be their daughter, the youngest in their family, with two older brothers who were, my brothers. And I had to come to accept that I was adopted, that I wasn't really of them. And the family name they had given me, and the first name that they had given me, and all of these markers of identity and self and role that I had been playing weren't mine. They weren't mine. They were someone else's. Not a bad way, but just a fact. And so I use that someone else's child phrase to remind myself and to remind other adoptees, like that's kind of what it's like before you come out of the fog, is you are trying to fill the role of someone else's child.
That hit me so hard because that's the first thing that people erase. That's the first piece of evidence that they go for, as you said, the name, the culture, the language,
Mm,
in my regard, right?
mm,
When I break down my adoption for people who are not part of the adoption constellation, who are still stuck in the dominant narrative of all things being good in adoption, I just break it down in parts. I was in Haiti. I
mm.
have an existing family. I have existing siblings and relatives who loved me, who thought the gesture of relinquishment was a gesture of love. And then I was taken by a stranger to California, told, this is your sister now. These are your grandparents now. This is the food that you will eat. This is the language that you will speak. And no one questioned whether that was okay with me, whether I felt safe in that transferring of identity. And they also said, this is the name that you will have from henceforth. And so it's just, I love how you framed that because a lot of people will resonate with the idea of that being the first thing that is erased and the constant thing that adoptees think about.
A lot of loss. And I think the phrase someone else's child also gives us permission to admit the strangeness of it. I think we often feel like we have to make sense of it. We have to be okay with it. We have to like name it, give it a place, this, that, and the other. Like, oh, that was grief. Okay, well, I was just grieving. And oh, well, that was, mother wound. Then I was just dealing with a mother wound, right? I fall into this at least, where I think if I can give it a name, I can make it less strange. And I like that phrase, someone else's child, because it reminds me that it was strange. And as a toddler at the time when I was adopted, that's all it could have been, was strange. And it just gives me some permission to allow that complexity, as you've mentioned, right? Like when you move into that transference of identity, it's bewildering, it's a lot, it's strange.
Do you think that we ever move out of the feeling of being someone else's child? How was it for you?
That's a great question. I see that playing out different ways for different adoptees, depending on their experience. I've met adoptees who played really hard into being someone else's child well into their 50s and 60s, and then they found out, oh, I've been somebody else's child this whole time, right? Like that's weird. But for me, I found that it gives me a greater peace to recognize that. And I've made peace with it in the sense that I understand now that I'm somebody else's child to my adoptive parents, as much as they love me as their own and think of me, I think, as their own to this day. But knowing that I am that gives me a way to interact with them that's much healthier for me, with more healthy boundaries, with more respect to my true self and my true identity. And it also gives me permission to understand and explore my birth identity and my biological heritage, which is an ideal integration, I think, for any adoptee coming out of the fog. So, to roughly answer your question, I think you find peace of the identity in different ways. And I've seen it happen for all different kinds of adoptees. I've seen other adoptees who they leave the fog and they rightly recognize the danger of their adopted family and they simply drop all of that, all of the pretense, all of the role playing, and lean hard into their completely new sense of self, their more authentic sense of self. And it can go either way. It just depends on the adoptee and the adoptee experience.
I'm sure you've listened to a lot of stories in your coaching about
Mm-hmm.
just this. What do we do when we cannot refuse the reckoning of being someone else's child, the curiosity behind that, of seeking out our reunifications? And that has a whole nother bag of worms that is unleashed when one meets their biological families, right? And so it's just a constant shadow, I think, on adoptees that is overlooked. Why do you think that in the dominant narrative, it is so overlooked? This, they had belonged to someone else. Why do you think it's imperative for adoptive parents to erase that in the beginning?
I would argue that that ties into the social development and perspectives of adoption and also the facts, the historical facts of how adoption started. It was there in the United States from the very beginning in the colonies, right? When children were born to Native Americans of settlers, right? They were taken into the settler families and they were thought like the only way to fix the stain of truly the father's sin, but they would of course not say it that way, was to pretend like that child had no associations with the native culture. And that was thought to make things good and to make things right. It cured that father's sin, to completely destroy that connection and say, you never, don't know, your mom died in childbirth. Surprise, you're raised by someone else, right? And it continued through the 1800s, the orphan trains, right? Where families destitute, struggling economically, were told, this is terrible, this is awful, you're never going to get out of this. The best thing you can do for your child is just put them on this train and forget about them and just let them go. And that's what happened. These children were shipped across the country and into the Great West and never heard or seen from again. Technically, technology limited parents from ever knowing what happened to them. And so, again, there was that social severing of your identity and your biological connection. And so we grew to this understanding of adoption into the modern century, too, to absolutely just change that. You could just transactionally buy and sell a child, basically, to a wealthy person who wanted a baby, who wanted a family, and it was considered the easiest way to do it. Oh yeah, just adopt, just adopt. Yeah, oh you can't have kids. Well, you just adopt. You just pay a generous sum to an agency that will match you. They didn't even match for a while. You know, if you look into Georgia Tan, I mean, she just sold to the highest bidder. It was quite
Yeah.
egregious. And it was thought that, oh, it's just a baby, right? Like there's nothing there. We didn't have any testing or DNA knowledge of DNA at the time or inherited traits, inherited trauma. Those were things that were not widely considered. And I think that that pervades how we view adoption to this day as, oh, you don't even need to think about your birth family. And then, of course, the adoptive parents want to be thought of as your parents for whatever reason. If they're filling a gap of infertility or they want to feel like they've saved you from some terrible end, as they may have been told they were doing by a social worker or what have you, they want you to forget about that because it's messy and it's uncomfortable for you. And they just don't want you to be uncomfortable and they want to be seen as your only ties in the world, and it's threatening to see that you have ties beyond that sometimes for different personalities. So it's very complex, but it boils down to your birth identity is exposing something that an adoptive family doesn't think they want, which is strange when you consider that they bring you into their home. But I think that's what it boils down to.
It is complex. And I think it has a lot to do as well with how capitalism is embedded in everything. Everything is a transaction. If
Mm-hmm.
I paid for this thing, why shouldn't it be perfect? Why shouldn't I
Mm-hmm.
get everything out of it that I want?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the indebtedness for adoptees comes in. Oftentimes, we struggle with this, oh, I was paid for, so I have to fulfill the role, fulfill the assignment. And in your coaching, because you do a lot of coaching, I want to talk about the services that you provide for adoptees. And I want to talk about what that reunion support looks like and why do we even need it?
Yeah, so yeah, I do offer reunion support as a specific type of coaching for adoptees who are ideally before you enter reunion, but more often than not, they're adoptees who entered reunion by themselves and find themselves struck by the intensity of it. I offer reunion support because I would say there is nothing more defining in your life as an adoptee than reunion. Not even your graduation from your college after you've chosen your major, not even marriage, maybe the birth of your first child probably is this transformative, but it is profound. It is one of the most bewildering, sometimes rewarding transitions an adoptee will go through. And in the same way that you deserve bridesmaids to help you get ready for your wedding or a doula to help you get ready for your child, I think adoptees deserve support when they enter reunion and they look their ancestry in the face for the first time and they hear the voice that is their own talk back to them on the phone. I just think it's something we deserve. It's a tremendous transition. It's a bewildering one, and it opens so many wounds, and it can heal some as well, depending on how it goes. And unlike a wedding or a birth or another major life transition, the outcome of a reunion is almost impossible to predict, which is scary. It's very frightening to go into something and say, I don't know what's going to happen on the end of this. I don't know if this is going to be, the healing moment that I'm hoping it is, or, my birth parent has faced so much trauma that they cause more trauma to me. And it's just risky. So for adoptees who want that, who believe that they deserve that, I like to offer that as an option.
I listened to you on another podcast and you talked about being able to accept your joy, to
Mm-hmm.
receive that joy. Now, when
Yes.
you are coaching adoptees, do you coach them in joy as well?
That's a very interesting way to put it, and not explicitly. I mean, I don't have like a let's sit down today and talk about this. That's what they want to talk about. But yes, I do. Ultimately, for sure, so much of what I do, now that you mention it, and I consider it for a moment, is about pursuing authentic joy, what genuinely gives them peace and joy. 80% of my conversations, now that I think of it with my clients, comes down to, like, how do you want to, like, what do you want the outcome of this to be for you? We can't control, if your birth parents are going to respond or not, and we can't control if your adoptive parents are going to respect a boundary or not, but we can figure out what you want for yourself and what you want to see when you look in your mirror, and how you want to live your life, which is, I suppose, the ultimate path to joy and peace. So I guess I do.
So there are a few tiers in your coaching. What are they? And what can you provide for the adoptees?
Oh, yeah, coaching is customized to every client. So, you know, I invite every adoptee before we even start coaching. We just meet and just get to know them and figure out where they're at in their journey. And it's genuinely, I mean, there's tiers, I suppose, but it's really just a matter of where you're at as an adoptee. Some adoptees I coach our college students or just fresh college graduates. And so they're in that wild journey of becoming an adult for the first time. And so much of that comes with identity and understanding their role to their adoptive family is changing as it comes for all of us in adulthood. I coach adoptees who have never ever looked into their adoption story, but they were baby scoop era adoptees. They find out that they were illegally trafficked, and we figure out ways to help them make peace of that and figure out what that means for them in their age with their children, with their grandchildren, how to start telling that story to them. I work with adoptees who are international, who are blocked from the opportunity to come into full reunion because the agency that they were adopted through has folded, or there's language barriers, and we try to find ways to reclaim that identity for themselves that they want to have with the unknowns and with the losses, and connect them to folks who can kind of guide them and be there for them in that way, even if they can't connect with birth family and reunion. So every client and every coaching experience is totally different. I have some clients I work on exclusively with just like boundary setting because they've got overbearing adoptive family. I've got clients I work on with identity. They've people pleased their whole life. They've played that role of somebody else's child and they're sick of it and they realize it's not working for them. And I say, I want you to go to a new restaurant this week. Like that's your goal. That's what we're doing for coaching. And you're going to pick a real different restaurant that just you want to go to and try it, and just practice some of those things and help them become themselves as much as they'd like to.
I love that. I have gotten a whiff of some of your wisdom on TikTok because you have 5 tips for dating.
Oh, yes. Oh, gosh. I was so impressed you found that because I made that TikTok like years ago. Yeah.
But I'm curious, what are they? When it comes to all of these issues of quality of life, which
Mm-hmm.
every human, struggles with, has to confront. Adoptees, I find the challenge is doubled because of the element of identity being lost or ruptured, the
Mm-hmm.
element of not having necessarily an inherent community to run to for these answers. What kind of juicy tips would you have for one still running the streets?
Yes, for the adoptees out there who want to date, dating is an exciting opportunity to sort of reset the clock for yourself and say, so this is the adoptive family I grew up with, and the culture and the expectations and the type of partnership or relationship that was expected. Very nice. Do I want that for myself? You don't necessarily have to want that for yourself. You can look out in the broad realm of the world and pick a different path, pick a different lifestyle. You don't even need to have a life partner if that's not your choice. You can date just for fun, just to meet people, just so there's a lot of different reasons. So I always say before you start dating, know what you want out of dating. Like where are you at in your life right now? Are you building a career and you're really enjoying your single experience and you just kind of want to meet people and have fun? That's fine. Are you ready to settle in with one person or one, couple and just be like, you're my people, and we'll build our house and our careers around each other for life? Figure that one out first, I always say. Decide the lifestyle you want, what you're getting out of dating before you go into it, and spend some time really getting to know who you want to be, apart from your adoptive family, apart from your biological family reunion. You're going to fit a little bit into each of those, and you're not going to fit into a little bit of each of those. So enjoy the discovery and be more patient with yourself, and don't rush into dating before you've had time to build your identity and say, I'm a morning person, or I really like to do spontaneous things, or I need routine. Figure that out before you start meeting people and getting to know them. So that way there's no muddleness when you start trying to get to know someone. You know exactly what you like and what you want. Um, and the second or the third tip, I suppose, so the first tip is to figure out what you want in your lifestyle, and the second is to figure out who you are. But the third tip is to remember that no one is perfect. And we often struggle with this as adoptees. We want someone to fit what we didn't have in our adoptive parents, right? Or what we didn't have when we entered reunion and realized there were limitations there. We want someone who is like a perfect complement and who is genuinely like whatever it is that we think we need in our life. And we'll do one of two things. We'll either bend over backwards ourselves and just absolutely obliterate our sense of self to try and match that person and become very codependent, perhaps. Or we may do the opposite and just be continually nitpicky and closed off and like, you're not it, you're not it, you're not it. Every slight is a huge one, right? Like we had a fight because we miscommunicated on something, and if you can't communicate to me, I'm not going to risk that. I already grew up in a slightly misattuned family as an adoptee, or I already faced a big blow up with my biological family reunion. I don't want to deal with that anymore. And we can shut people out a little bit too quickly, or we can cleave to them too hard. So try to find the middle ground, I would say, and be respectful of the fact that no one's a perfect partner. You become a perfect partner through choice and through repetition and through time, not automatically. And my last tip, of course, for adoptees is try to really check in with yourself. Take extra time to check in with yourself, because we struggle with relationship development more than the average person, I would think. We tend to face more anxiety, doubt, self-criticism, or criticism of our partner than perhaps the average person, because of the complexity of the dynamic we had in our first relationships, right? Our very first relationship with our birth mother, lost, tremendous grief. Our very first relationship with our adoptive family, confusing, perhaps misattuned. Our very first relationships when we first started dating with no intention, with no knowledge of who we were, maybe damaging, maybe disorienting. And so take a lot of time throughout your dating process, wherever you are, to genuinely and without the influence of your partner, or even I would say your friends directly, just check in with yourself and say, do I feel safe? Do I feel seen? Have I communicated if I need to feel more safe or more seen? And is my partner receptive to that? And what can we do to improve that? How can we, as a couple or a throuple or whatever your dating relationship may be, as a team, how can we make me feel more safe and seen? And what am I doing first and foremost to make sure that I am safe and seen? Those are my tips for dating.
That's great. I love it. Along the lines of dating, when do you think of course, this is all like situational and individualistic, but when do you think adoptees should talk about their adoption with the person that they're dating? And as you being a great example of someone who's married, when did you disclose your adoption traumas and secrets to your beloved?
Yeah, so my husband and I have been married for about 4 years, and I told him that I was adopted probably maybe 3 or 4 months into the relationship, when we had fun getting to know each other, really enjoy each other, we're really great. And then I said, yeah, and a big part of my identity is that I'm adopted. And he, like most people who are not adopted, did not register what that meant or if that was significant. And he's like, oh, okay, cool. And we moved on, and I kind of let it lie for a little while. And then I started talking a little bit more about like the stuff I'm doing on the internet and what we talk about in my posts. And he was curious from just like a mental health perspective. But again, the mark was missed sometimes, because perhaps like anyone who encounters someone of a different background or culture or trauma than theirs, it doesn't make a lot of sense at first. But he was patient and he was curious, and I asked for more patience and more curiosity when I shared something this precious. I think for other adoptees, when you're trying to decide when to share that information, I think you should share that information when you have established safety with the person you're dating. So you know that they're a safe, respectful person. They're not going to, blast you or tease you about being adopted. I've seen some horrible viral videos of very bad partners who use their partners being adopted as a way to mock them. Very not good. You don't want a partner like that. You will have to guide them too. So whenever you decide that the relationship is safe and that you've been seen for who you want to be seen as, and you're seeing your partner for who they present themselves as, you can share that you're adopted. And then you may need to guide them a little bit and say, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about being adopted. And you probably think you know what being adopted means, but there's a lot more to it if you're open to it. And share it with them in that sort of way to help them understand. I think many adoptees that I coach and I hear from, they want their partners to like understand innately what that means. And I don't think that's totally realistic. I think we have to guide them a little bit in understanding the complexities we experience.
I agree. We do need to guide them. We can't expect people to understand, because this society has really blanketed and hidden a lot of the truths about adoption. Where can people find you?
I am always active on Instagram at adoptee_reclaimed. That's me. You can always send me a DM. I love meeting adoptees from all backgrounds and experiences. And I have an adoptees only close friends story. So DM me if you find me on Instagram to let me know that you're an adoptee, and you will get some adoptees only content for free. You can find me on the internet. I have a website, I blog, and not all of my blog content ends up on my Instagram. So if you want some super secret stuff, that's the best way to do it. And I also have a Facebook page, also Adoptee Reclaimed, very consistent here, that I post a significant portion, but not quite all, of the content that I post on Instagram.